The morning bell rang across Jefferson High School, its metallic echo bouncing down the gleaming hallways, signaling another day in the sprawling building where the whispers of ambition and prejudice often collided, and in that moment, Maya Johnson adjusted her backpack strap, her small frame moving carefully through the crowd of teenagers who towered over her, their designer sneakers squeaking against the floor while her worn but neatly cleaned shoes carried her with quiet determination. Because Maya had grown used to standing out, not because of anything she did wrong, but because of who she was. The daughter of the school janitor, a black man named Thomas Johnson who spent his days pushing a mop, emptying trash cans, fixing leaky faucets, and doing the work most of the students and even some teachers looked down upon, though Maya saw him as nothing less than a hero, because to her, every sweat-soaked shirt he carried home was a badge of honor, proof that he was building a future for her. Proof that dignity had nothing to do with titles but with heart, and though she carried that pride in her chest, it didn't protect her from the snickers, the sideways glances, the subtle cruelties of adolescence that struck like invisible daggers every day she walked these halls, for kids could be cruel and teachers, sometimes, crueler, especially Ms. Carmichael, the English teacher who stood before her first period class that Tuesday morning, a tall woman with sharp features and an even sharper tongue, who believed she could measure worth by wealth, who had always found ways to chip at Maya's confidence, who called her answers lucky guesses, who returned her essays with more red ink than anyone else's, who seemed to resent the very idea that Maya, the janitor's daughter, could be capable of brilliance, and today would be no different, for it was the day of poetry presentations, an assignment Ms. Carmichael claimed was designed to give voice to the students' souls, though in truth she had already decided which voices deserved to be heard and which ones did not, and when Maya walked in, clutching her notebook filled with carefully written verses she had stayed up late perfecting, she could feel her classmates' eyes on her, some pitying, some mocking, a few indifferent, but all too aware of who she was, because children mirror the whispers of their parents, and Maya's identity had been carved into their minds. The janitor's kid, the girl who probably smelled of bleach and floor wax, the one who didn't belong, and yet Maya sat down with quiet dignity, determined that today she would let her words speak for her, determined to show them all that her father's daughter carried stories worth hearing. But as the class began and one by one students rose to recite their shallow rhymes about love songs, social media, or weekend parties, Maya's turn loomed closer like a storm cloud, and her heart thudded louder with each passing name until at last Ms. Carmichael looked down her list and called, Maya Johnson, her voice laced with something almost gleeful, as though she relished the idea of watching the shy girl falter, and Maya rose, her palms slick with nerves, her throat dry, her notebook clutched so tightly her knuckles whitened, but still she walked to the front, and when she opened her mouth, her voice quavered at first yet found its strength as she began to read her poem. Words woven from nights of watching her father return exhausted, but smiling, words about resilience, about rising above circumstance, about shadows turning into light, and for a fleeting moment, the room grew still, even the restless boys in the back who usually disrupted every presentation paused to listen, for Maya's voice carried something raw and true, a resonance deeper than their years, but just as the power of her verse began to wash over them, Ms. Carmichael's sharp tone cut through the air like a blade. Enough, Maya, she said, raising her hand, do you even understand what you've written? These words, this style, it's far too sophisticated for you. Are you sure you didn't borrow this from somewhere? And the silence in the room fractured into whispers, then into stifled giggles, some students smirking at the accusation, others shifting uncomfortably in their seats, and Maya froze, her face flushing hot, her lips parting to protest, whispering, I wrote it myself, but Miss Carmichael smirked coldly, stepping forward to snatch the notebook from Maya's trembling hands, flipping through the pages as though hunting for evidence of dishonesty. Before announcing dramatically, class, I think we've stumbled upon a little plagiarism, her voice dripping with condescension, and the room erupted in laughter, cruel and biting, every giggle a knife twisting in Maya's chest, until, in a gesture meant to finalize the humiliation, Ms. Carmichael tore one of the pages from the notebook, the paper ripping loud and jagged in the air, holding it aloft as though exposing a fraud, and Maya's vision blurred with tears she refused to let fall, her heart pounding with the urge to scream that these were her words, her truth, her life, but her voice was drowned out by laughter and derision, until the door creaked open and in stepped Thomas Johnson, pushing his mop bucket, his uniform faded, his hands calloused, his face tired yet carrying the quiet strength of a man who had weathered storms greater than ridicule, and he stopped dead, his eyes locking onto his daughter's tear-streaked face, the ripped page in Miss Carmichael's hand, the laughter of children echoing in the room, and a silence fell like a blanket, smothering the giggles as the students realized who had entered, and Miss Carmichael, still clutching the torn paper, sneered, "Oh, how convenient, the janitor's here." "Perhaps you can confirm whether Maya actually wrote this," her words meant to sting, to diminish, but Thomas did not flinch. He set down his mop with deliberate calm, walked to the front of the classroom, and with a steady hand retrieved the torn page from her grip, smoothing it against his palm, his eyes not on the teacher but on his daughter, eyes filled with both pain and pride, and then he turned to the class, his voice deep, resonant, carrying the weight of truth. "Every word on this page is hers," he said firmly, "because she's lived it. She's watched me work through nights so she could study, she's seen me scrub floors so she could write verses about resilience. She doesn't need to copy anyone, because her life is poetry." And then, astonishing everyone, he turned to Maya and asked gently, "Baby girl, do you remember your words?" And though her lips trembled, Maya nodded, wiping her tears, lifting her chin, and with her father's unwavering gaze grounding her, she began to recite her poem from memory, line after line spilling forth with more strength than when she had read from the page, her voice rising, trembling but refusing to break, and as she spoke, the room grew utterly silent, the mocking smirks fading, the restless boys leaning forward, the girls in the back lowering their phones, because what they heard was not just a poem but a truth that demanded respect, and by the time she finished, her final line ringing like a bell, the class was frozen, stunned into silence so thick it felt as though time itself had stopped, until one student, hesitant, ashamed, began to clap, and then another, and then the sound swelled until the room that once mocked her now filled with applause, hesitant at first, then strong, echoing against the walls, while Ms. Carmichael stood pale and speechless, her attempt at humiliation backfiring spectacularly, and Thomas Johnson, his arm wrapping protectively around his daughter, allowed the smallest smile to break across his weary face, pride radiating from him as he looked at her, not as the janitor's daughter but as a young woman who had just silenced cruelty with courage, who had turned humiliation into triumph, leaving everyone, students, teacher, and all, utterly frozen in awe of the undeniable truth that brilliance and dignity cannot be erased, no matter how deeply someone tries to bury them.